Welcome to CRE Unplugged, the Founder Series. I'm your host, Ryan Elazari. The Founder Series is where we spotlight the founders who are reimagining the future of the built world. Today's guests are Devin Boesen and Jon Liggett of CENSAI, a population intelligence platform that is transforming how real estate investors, operators, and policy leaders read the American landscape. CENSAI pairs consumer and demographic data going back to 2009 with AI-driven analytics to deliver insights at the zip code and the building level. Devin leads population and migration products with a master's in economics from George Mason and a graduate fellowship at the Mercator Center. Jon heads data partnerships and holds a BBA from UNC and has spent his career building and scaling proprietary data assets across industries. Today's conversation will explore the origin of CENSAI and the data that has sparked it, how climate and insurance withdrawal are reshaping where Americans actually move, what AI is doing inside their company right now that the rest of the industry is only talking about, and the policy fight, data center development that is dividing communities across the country. And with that, I'm excited to introduce Devin Boesen and Jon Liggett of CENSAI. How are you guys?
Great. Thanks for having us, Ryan.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Nice to be on the show.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you for coming on. I know that you both travel a lot. You're going to conferences, you're going to meet with clients. What's your preference when you're traveling on a plane? Like, are you a window seat or aisle seat person?
I used to be a window seat person because I wanted the window to rest my head. I prefer the aisle now. I except I don't like when people ask me to get up for them. Admittedly, I don't want to move once I sit down, but I also like the comfort. If I need to get up to use the restroom, I don't have to climb over someone else.
I'm window all the way. Always have been. I like it. Like if you're flying, we're both based on the East Coast. And if you're going out to Vegas for a conference or, the West Coast, I could just be entertained staring out the window for hours, just looking at the geography. I was always into maps as a kid, and it feels like you get the most live map looking out the window. So
But
yeah,
Jon, don't you feel bad like waking people up mid-sleep to go to the bathroom?
I just hold it.
Really? You could hold it?
Oh yeah, yeah. You got a plan, but yeah. I rarely need to get up for 6 hours. I can go all the way.
Fair.
Jon, you know the reference that you've made where you're just staring at the window, that's known as raw dogging.
Is
I don't even
it?
think you're allowed to
Yeah.
stare out the window with raw dogging. I think you just have to stare at
Yeah.
the blank screen.
Oh, just stare at the blank screen so the window doesn't count?
I don't think the window counts. It
Yeah,
sounds like
Okay.
pure
All right.
torture to me, but
Okay.
yeah.
Well,
I've
it's
got kids,
funny.
and so when I travel with my kids, I'm always pointing at things like, look at that. Can you see what is that? What do you see? And like they're never as interested as I am in like what's going on.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm an aisle person because I always have to get up to use the bathroom, and like my issue is I have broad shoulders, so I always get hit from behind while I'm trying to like watch something or read something, and it's not pleasant. But like I also have long legs, and I just can't be like stuck into the window seat.
so Ryan, are you always trying to get into the emergency aisle?
Yes, I am. And I've learned that it's sometimes if you wait long enough, and let's say you don't have like a seat like assigned to you, if you wait long enough, they end up putting you in that window aisle or the exit aisle. So it works out.
Nice. Nice.
Yeah, one other thing I wanted to talk to you guys about because we're recording in the morning. Like, what is one thing you have to do every morning before you start your day?
Drop my kids off at school. No, I say that jokingly. For me, I really need like the 30 minutes when I get into the office, because I get here earlier than most of our office gets in. I need those 30 minutes to collect and plan my day and see what we're working with. I really love that like 8:15 to 8:45 window is my time to grab a coffee, sit down, look at where we were yesterday with development, look at what's outstanding, check all the big things that are coming in across our pipeline. So those 30 minutes are mine.
I would just say coffee. Like I come down, hit the machine, 2 cups before anyone's downstairs, and then get the kids to school, and then that's when quiet time happens, right? Around 8:05. Like, yeah, I work
Yeah.
remote,
It's
part
that like
time.
window of no chaos, right? Like the
Yeah, it's
window
like when the
before the day
chaos
starts
ends.
and after you
Yeah,
get your kids out of the house,
yeah,
that's your window.
right.
I've never cherished quiet time more in my life since I've had kids. I'm totally in agreement with you. There's nothing that beats quiet time. And, for Mother's Day, we went away, and when we put the kids to sleep, it was just like the fact that we had a little bit of quiet. It really changes like how you like feel when you're just trying to do simple things every day. So yeah, I'm definitely in agreement. Well, I really want to get and dive into your origin story. I think what was really interesting is that you both didn't meet at a college dorm or at an accelerator. You both came in mid-career. You're putting your reputations on the line. So, what did you see each other early on that made you willing to tie your name together and start Sensei?
Yeah, John, do you want to start or do you want me to start?
Yeah, no, I'd be happy. So, I came into the organization kind of through a back channel. I'd had a startup that I'd started in 2018, and had worked with the broader organization that Sensei's under, Coke, and they've been a client of mine for that startup. And we sold the business right during COVID, during 2021, and they invited me to come in to talk about what it was like to sell into financial services, right? Like my startup was using data to kind of do some compliance checks and real-time monitoring. And so the first thing, I came in, thought I was going to walk them through a day of like, this is the type of customers you work with, this is like all the problems. And I walked out with a job offer, which I was not expecting, right? And so I was quite honestly, I'd just gotten out of a startup and I didn't know what I was going to do next. And so it looked like a great organization, a lot of smart people. I was like this working on data, which is like what I nerd out on oftentimes. And I was like, yeah, sounds like a great opportunity. Let me just go try it. And so like when I first, I think Devin and I both remember, they were like, Devin, I think, had just gotten back from maternity leave, and they like, here, you're going to be working with Devin. And they threw us in a conference room and they're like, go figure out what data we have and what we can make with this data that, Jon can sell.
Yeah,
And so literally our first meeting was in a conference room in Arlington, Virginia. Hi, nice to meet you. What are we going to build? Right. And like, it was a brainstorming session.
yeah, I mean, that's exactly what happened. I think that day is so clear in my mind. I think John said I came back from maternity leave. I think it might have been like my first or second day back. So like really just back and a big change. But I think, you know, for me personally, looking back on my career, where I've, always performed best is whenever I felt really passionate about something that we were building. So at first, I remember sitting in the room being like, I don't know who this guy is. But this at least sounds like a fun experiment. Let's roll with it. And I think very quickly over a few months, whether, John's way of working had been contagious or my way of working had been contagious, I think we both settled in on there's actually something really here that we should continue to pursue. And then, John has such good experience. He has a network in the financial services space. I had really missed working in a fintech space. And so while real estate is not where we were originally starting, I think we kind of started putting our minds together about knowing our backgrounds, knowing the industries a little bit, and wanting to do more with data there. So it was very exciting at first. But we just have a very similar style of working. And we kind of move at the same speed and have a sense of urgency about wanting to get something done and getting something pushed through. So, I think pretty quickly I realized that I needed Jon to do whatever we were going to do next.
That's really special that you both got put in this situation where you didn't know each other, you didn't know how your personalities were going to match, but because you both realize the goal and what you had in place and how it could grow to where it is now, it's really amazing how it all like worked out and you guys like, you know, put your minds together and said to each other like, we can do this. Like we can, we both can use our each other's skills and take this to the next level.
Yeah, I think for me, at least at the end of the day, it comes down to trust. And I know, we've definitely had disagreements on things. We have different ideas about how you place a feature in the platform or what's the most compelling or how you tie that out to a use case. But ultimately, I think we both know what our end objective is. And so that's made it, I trust Jon when he's coming with something to me and vice versa. And so that has made it very easy to get to, I guess, 4 years later into this.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say it was like, the sense of urgency and how we work. I don't know if the person who put us together kind of understood that at some level, but it was just like, hey, we can get our hands dirty, we can get in together and fix things. We all have a sense of like not liking bureaucracy or speed bumps that get in our way internally. We both kind of just want to drive right through them, and so that's made it really helpful because we're always on the same page, about what the goal is. So yeah, it's been great.
Yeah.
And Devin's comes from a background of like she had a diverse background in policy and econometrics and things. And my background has been more like literally I was a macro trader at a fund, and then I was an allocator to hedge funds. And so I had all this like financial experience, and she had all this policy experience. And then she actually knew how the organization worked. Because if I'd come in and just been alone, I wouldn't have understood like all the data assets we have, how different personalities in the organization. Because it wasn't like we were joining a startup. I was joining a firm that had been around since '09 with 120 people in an office in Arlington, a lot of whom had worked together since day one together. And I was totally the outsider. So I needed someone that would be like, bring me in and like make me not seem so scary, in the organization. So it was great.
Yeah. No, and like I think when we first started going to conferences, Jon has so much experience in the financial services space that I would sit there and admittedly, I would sit and memorize things that he was saying to learn, how do you speak to this space? Like, how does this audience receive what is being said? And so it was a big learning curve for me. And then we transferred into the prop tech space a little bit. And I think that was a little bit of a learning curve for both of us, but really being able to sit and spar with Jon and understand, like, how do you make something resonate with the person on the other side of the table? That's been really invaluable to me because I could talk about our assets all day long, but I needed Jon to help me piece that puzzle together for how do I talk about that with, a private equity firm sitting on the other side of me. And so that I think, we've just played off of each other's strengths a lot.
Yeah, sounds like a great partnership. And CENSAI started during COVID, so the entire country was moving and data to track it didn't really exist, right? So what's a specific question a customer or partner asked that you couldn't answer, and how did one unanswered question turn into a company?
Yeah, I think it wasn't maybe one question that we couldn't answer. It was more of we were getting questions of, is this really happening? And so, we were seeing really heavy reliance early 2021 on census data trying to pick up migration trends. And we had clients who were using pretty stale data. And at the same time, you were having hit pieces come out from Bloomberg or The Atlantic, talking U-Haul surveys, talking about where individuals were moving. And the question was, can you guys answer this in real time? What's unique about our data is our data goes down to, we call it like the person level or the individual level. So Ryan, if we wanted to know, where your move records were over the last 8 to 10 years, then we would be able to say Ryan moved from point A to point B. So it became, at first it started as a really trying to solidify what our data was telling us, and can we prove a point here with our data compared to Bloomberg. So I think the question wasn't so much of we can't answer that, but on the other side of the table, our clients asking us, can you really answer that? And us being able to
Or
start
can you
showing
give
it.
us more insight into
Yeah.
what's going on, right? Like the U-Haul one is a great example. It's like literally they're tracking, where U-Haul's picked up and where it's dropped off. And like, you kind of got this deadhead movement where you got U-Hauls piling up in Florida and nowhere for them to go back to. And we're like, okay, that's a small sample size, that gives you this kind of macro picture that something's happening, right? And even like there's other data sets like mobile phone data, right? Like so you can think of all the app data and things coming out about where a phone sleeps at night, right? And those are like small panel sizes. They didn't actually know the people attached to the phones. They just knew that suddenly a phone was sleeping somewhere else rather than, the previous spot. And we are like, gosh, we got all this individual data that we built for nonprofit work and all this kind of stuff. And we have this address history. We can actually aggregate it, right? And like tell them this is the age of people, it's the income of the people moving from one spot to another. This is the population paths, right? Like there's just so much more, insight and color we could get on what was actually happening than what was in a lot of those press articles and the data sets that were being used. And we are like, surely, we're onto something. And so that's kind of what drove this like the first data set we put together, which was really just a data set. It wasn't an app, it wasn't anything. It was just like, hey, let's just look at the SQL tables and figure out what we got, you
Yeah.
know?
I think it was so interesting to come into the space because what we kept finding was data set after data set. They had, their niche data, whether it was mobile data or something else. And then they were trying to triangulate that back to census data. And it's just an imperfect measure of what was really happening in a market. So to Jon's point, we started with Excel tables or, SQL code, where we were just showing raw code to prospective clients looking at, very small data tables, and it turned into something so much more when we started building data streams off of it and then platform around it.
And the census stuff, like, they took a census in 2020, which was during COVID, which in a lot of ways was considered kind of a failed census in a way, because,
Yeah.
so there's a lot of issues that came up with that. And we're like, look, we're not going to build our data product based upon census data, just normalizing. In sales calls, I call it putting lipstick on census data. We had a row level source of all this information, and so we were going to go with that as our source of truth rather than the historical census data. And so that was kind of the key to our underpinning to the product was like this is a different view of what the nation looks like.
Yeah, so let's talk about like the first sales call you ever had.
Yeah.
Like who was across the table and when like did that company kind of their posture change and realize like, wow, this is actually something
Well,
we really
with
need.
all startups, we weren't a startup, but we kind of were a startup, right? Like we're in this organization. So I started calling my friends, right? And you're like, hey, I got something. Can we talk to you about it, right? And so I think about our first customer, and he'll probably see this at some point after this. We won't name names, but I called him and said, like, how could this data help you, right? Like, let's walk through like what do you not know that would be helpful to know? Help me put the pieces together here. And so it was actually used in diligence for a large transaction in the Bronx for an apartment building. And, they were trying to get a better insight, not necessarily into, turnover in that building, but we had the turnover data, like, how many people moved in, how many people moved out, but what types of people moved in, what types of people moved out based on income levels, that there'd been like a rehab on the building to make it more, um, you know, uh, pricing for residents, right? And they wanted to show that turnover had decreased, that incomes had gone up. That's what they thought had happened, but they didn't actually know. And we were able to go in and prove that, that was in fact the case, right? They had improved um, they had improved their turnover rates, meaning people were staying longer, they were leaving less often. The incomes of the people in the building had risen, meaning it had become a more desirable place to live. Um, and they were kind of shocked, like, yes, I want this data for any building. We want to put this in the diligence packet. We want to show this to, the large real estate group that's buying the building, to prove that our rehab had added value essentially to the property. So that was the first one. And that's when we kind of were like, okay, now let's see if we can repeat this, right? Like,
And then we did repeat it in a couple different ways over
yeah.
the coming months. So I think, that one really stands out to Jon, but there was two other ones that really stood out to me because we were working on a pretty small scale to start. But the next one was, what can you tell us about student housing? And that's when things started, for me personally, started to get really interesting. And what we were doing for that client is we were taking individuals that lived in and around a university campus, and we were tying them back to our best ability to their parents' addresses to get a full picture of their family's income. And the reason for doing that was because they wanted to go in and understand, can we raise rents on this luxury student housing property? And the
Or
only
can we build a new one?
or can we build a new one? And the
Yeah.
only data that they could get was around Pell Grant data at the university, which, is at like complete juxtaposition for what their end goal was. And so we started building out our capability of taking one individual and trying to determine, based on the household that they came from, what was their actual family income status. And that was a really successful case study for us, where we could really determine, can they raise rents or can they build new luxury properties here? That one really stands out to me for many reasons, but that one was just, we started learning about all of the different ways that we could apply this level of granularity in our data set and the richness that we were going to get from it. And then I think another one after that is we, generally in our role, we don't make recommendations on investment decisions at all. So we stay away from that, but we do our best to work with our clients to provide them data so that they can. And in another one, we got to dive really deep into some of our more niche data assets that we have, where we were working with a client who wanted to do some development in South Florida. And they wanted to do mixed use and high-end retail, but they really weren't sure of what the snowbird effect was. And was there really an audience base that was moving down from New York or from somewhere else in New England? And were they staying in South Florida? And so, we pulled together a few niche data sources outside of just the traditional age, education, income, started looking at some of our upscale consumer behavioral data. And not just based on our data, but on several other insights, the company chose to invest and they expanded their portfolio since then. But being able to provide that niche insight to them was certainly a factor.
Yeah, with this niche data and what you're bringing them, it's kind of invaluable, right? Because you're giving them something that they were not even, they didn't even know would exist or even be able to be brought to them, and you're bringing that for them, and it could impact major decisions in if they want to build or if they, what they want to bring in as tenants. Like it's pretty amazing
Yeah, and
what
understanding the
you're able to
TAM for the
do.
real estate, right? Like, like local, like, hey, you've got this idea, the student housing being a key one, are there enough high income students per se or families to support this development here versus,
Yeah.
maybe in a Dallas suburb looks, the student population looks totally different than it does in the Indiana suburb, right? And so really understanding what is your TAM, like where are those places, like that was a huge component. And like, yeah, and it just kind of took off from there, honestly. Like I think the challenge now is really like helping people understand like what they thought they couldn't answer before, can they answer now? And yeah.
Yeah, and John, you've been pulling data now on insurance company withdrawal from vulnerable coastal markets.
Yeah.
So if an insurance company is pulling out of a market, is that a leading or lagging indicator of where people are moving?
Well,
And
look, I will.
yeah,
Go ahead,
go ahead.
Ryan. Sorry.
No, no, I was going to say like what is that determining with the data telling you about the Gulf Coast right now? I know you brought up Florida, but we'd love
Yeah.
to get your take.
So look, we're not insurance experts by any means. So I just want to preface
Right.
that.
Yeah.
The insurance market is very complicated. And there's confounding variables to all of this over the past 5 years, right? So you've got, the COVID effect that drove people into these markets, right? And then you've also got kind of the hurricane effect, for lack of a better term, where there's been some big storms and there's been some destruction of capital in the insurance industry, right? Um,
Yeah.
and you kind of, when you're trying to look at this, you've got to separate out those two things, right? You've got to somehow control for the fact that there's net population inflows at times, but then how does that, how do you compare the unaffected areas to the affected areas, right? Because storms are, outside hurricanes and even hurricanes themselves are sometimes very local events, right? Like they affect
Yeah.
different areas differently. Um, and so, the takeaway that I could tell you is that, we published a little blog post on some of the data I did, and we've looked at this, and like there's other confounding factors, right? House prices have gone up, construction costs have gone up, right? So like that naturally increases the cost of insurance in these areas, right? Like, um, and so yes, we see effects, right? You see effects from storms. Storms wipe out capital really in the reinsurance industry, right? Every
Right.
insurer out there has to go and get cat insurance for the book of insurance they're writing locally. And what tends to happen is you have these waves or these cycles in the reinsurance industry where capital is very available, and then after a storm, capital gets wiped out, and that reinsurance capital gets very expensive, and that drives everyone's insurance up, and a lot of people leave the market. We saw that in Florida after Ida. You had a $113 billion, I think, event, right? That like of destruction, and then you had a lot of insurance companies leave the market, right? And they all went on to the Florida Citizen Plan, which is like the state plan. But more recently, you've seen capital come back into that market. So now a lot of people have left the Citizen Plan, have gone back to private insurers, right? Capital's been reformed essentially since those storms. Net, net, yeah, insurance costs are up a lot. And you've seen, you know, versus control, you've seen net negative migration out of those hit areas. And you've seen tougher real estate markets in some of those places hit by storms. So it's affected the value of the properties in those storms, in the path of those storms. But again, it's a very complicated issue with a lot of confounding variables that makes it hard to say it's just it's just the storm or the climate change, right? Like, um, but yeah, the takeaway is it's very much driven by the losses and the availability of reinsurance, for these markets to function. Same in Florida, in California with a fire, right? So
Yeah.
Palisades, you take out, and personally, I had some friends very much affected by the Palisades fire. In fact, I had friends affected by the Asheville flooding that took place. Very personal stories of people, losing homes and having their lives affected. And what you do see is that like there's been places where the government's had to step in as the insurer of last resort, in a sense, to keep the market functioning. But the market does heal after a time, right? Like as long as rates are allowed to kind of follow market prices, they can price it appropriately, the risk appropriately, and the local market will respond to that, whether it's how they build, what they build, the type of person living in that area, whether they can afford it or not, are the views worth the risk? And yeah, so you definitely see like a change in some of these areas in terms of like who can actually afford to live there and take the risk versus who can't afford to live there and take the risk. But at some cost, the risk is insurable. It's just like it's it's how you're splitting the economics of it.
Yeah, John, there's a lot of futurists out there that are talking about how, the Gulf Coast and, possibly on the West Coast with the fires, that it's going to create this migration into the Midwest because they see that climate change is not going to affect them. Is that
Right.
something that you're seeing right now, or is that a good
Well,
prediction by these
it's
futurists?
funny you say that because, one of the things I looked at was the insurance burden across the US, right? And the burden you can think of is like the cost of the insurance relative to the incomes in the area. And the Midwest is a huge wind place, right? They get tons of tornadoes,
Yeah.
wind, and actually insurance burdens in the Midwest based upon income and housing values are some of the highest in the country. Um, we are seeing, because the housing stock in the Midwest is a lot more affordable, right? Like people moving into the area, but it doesn't mean that it's a climate haven per se, because, they deal with powerful wind events and storms, all summer long, and the insurance rates in those areas reflect it. It's, Oklahoma is a very expensive place to get home insurance, even though the homes are inexpensive. Um, but the frequencies of those events is pretty steady. Like that there's going to be storms, right? Like it's not like a once in 5 years you come and wipe out capital. You're getting events every 6 weeks across the whole Midwest, so it's a little bit more predictable in a sense,
I would say
because
there's
it's lower severity in insurance terms and higher frequency, so you kind of know how to price the risk, um, if that makes sense. We are seeing, um, both in some of our construction data that we work on more recently and in some of the migration patterns, a strong Midwest flow. That makes sense. And by Midwest, I kind of mean like west of the Mississippi, like St. Louis, Arkansas,
Montana.
Iowa, places like that.
Yeah, we see that. I think one other thing to keep in mind too with migration trends is you do see the Midwest starting to have some sort of revival. Um, but the Sun Belt is still growing at a relatively stable pace. You see that continuing. But I think the biggest thing to keep in mind when we're talking about migration is the majority of moves outside of the pandemic, where you were seeing really big state to state changes, they're still happening within a local perimeter of where you are moving from. So you might be living in the Gulf Coast of Florida or on the eastern seaboard, of Miami and Fort Lauderdale. But what we're seeing is we're starting to see moves move a little bit more inward in the coast. And so parts of Orlando are starting to really grow. And those things I think are a little bit more immediate impact of climate change than large, moving from Florida up to Idaho or Montana. So I think keeping that piece in mind, you do see people moving away from those areas, but sometimes they're just moving a little bit further in.
Yeah, I guess it's a slow process, right? You can't just say like, oh, everyone's just gonna go and go up 1,000 miles and start living out there because they're worried about the disaster event. So yeah, it does make sense that they're going more inward so that they're away from the coastal lines.
Yeah, and we work with one of the developers in Florida, and Tampa is a good friend of mine from way back, and we chat from time to time. And he develops kind of inland off in Tampa, and he's like, the storms don't affect us. If anything,
Yeah.
it's a positive for us because that's when people realize they kind of need to get a little more inland, but they don't want to leave the area. All their friends are here, all their life is here. They're just going to make themselves a little more resilient to these type of things, and it doesn't take a, 1,000-mile move to do that.
Right. And then you also see the value of these homes and buildings go up, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. One thing I really wanted to talk to you about, because you're hearing about this all the time right now with how AI is impacting and changing the ways that you're doing business. You hear it in all different departments of business lines. But I would love to know like how AI is changing your workflows like every day. Like where is it making the biggest impact like in the last 3 months? Because AI is changing so fast for me to ask you like what did you do last year, I don't even think it's fair. So I'm saying 3 months because I think that would be a good way to kind of understand what's going on in your company.
Yeah, I think there's two different ways that we think about AI. We're thinking about AI from how are we forward facing to our clients? And what does that mean in terms, especially right now, I think it comes down to AI has really democratized the way data can be used and the way you can get your hands on data. And it's also enabled and empowered people who haven't really been able to wrangle code before to get their hands dirty with data. So there's a forward facing aspect, but internally, we're also using AI all of the time, even if it's, for very mundane tasks. But I think, we're having continuous conversations about what does AI mean to our customers and how do we make our data more accessible to them, considering how their workflows may have changed. But internally for us, I think, some of the best ways of using AI is rapid prototyping, rapid feedback internally on features that we're putting out, and just really boosting the amount that we can get done in a shorter time frame. So that in the last 3 months, if I think about where AI has impacted me the most, it's been on speed to market for a lot of things.
Yeah, and I don't disagree. I mean, when I joined CENSAI, Rushmore, our organization, I was probably by far the worst coder in there. And like, I was self-taught. I'd spent most of my life in Excel and maybe a little bit of SQL in my startup, but I had hired developers to do things. And I'm like, and occasionally I would need to write a blog post or do something data driven, and I would spend hours late at night looking at Stack Overflow, figuring out how to write a command in Python to make this chart look pretty. And now I'm like, I feel like I got superpowers, right? Like, I'm like, give data, talk to Claude Code, or Cursor and turn. And, it's not like you understand what the product should be, and you need to still have that context of what's right and what's wrong. That's one of the things internally that, I think you can bring to the table is like, hey, it outputs something, but is that output correct? Right. And like, but it has given us like just amazing ability to turn over ideas and generate new, use cases, validate, backtest much quicker, right? And even in marketing, like, showing and visualizing a lot of the stuff that would have taken days to kind of do, we can turn around in a couple of hours. So like it's I mean, I feel like I'm super excited by it all and love using it every day and get frustrated when I dig into something and then didn't go to AI first to start on something, right? Like it's part of my problem, and I think everyone's dealing with this is like, wait, all our work habits have to change now, like the way we approach a problem, and that's probably one of the more exciting things, but also one of the more frustrating things is like, wait, why did you just spend 3 hours in Excel trying to do that, right? Like you could have turned around a prototype in 15 minutes and shown, right?
Like the amount of prototyping that I do as the business leader now is like either my developers love me or hate me, because
Yeah, exactly.
I can pass along things to them so much more quickly, but I can pass it along where it's like very crystal clear exactly what the objective is. And I've also used it to, like pick apart whatever requirements I just wrote. And for as hard as we try to predict second, third order impacts of anything we're rolling out, we're always missing something. And this has just really helped to think through like, what have we not thought about here? Where are we not leveraging our skill enough? And how do we change some of that? And so it's been definitely the last couple of months, it's been a huge acceleration for us internally. And you feel like you're getting more hours in a day, honestly. Like you
Yeah.
are able to kick off so many different streams at once. And we run a very lean team. And so having the ability to have, essentially even just an assistant in the morning to tell you what you need to focus on for the day is just really impactful to everyone that's contributing to CENSAI. So it's really great for us.
Yeah, I was reading about how a company, they were thinking about hiring like three acquisition analysts, and then they hired one, and then he started using Claude Code, and they realized, wait, we actually don't need like the two other analysts we were going to hire. Like we can just use Claude, and it's able. So I think what I've come to a conclusion on is I don't think AI is going to take people's roles. What I think what's going to happen is the people who know how to use the tools of AI, they're going to have the advantage of the people that don't, and those people are going to unfortunately lose their roles at companies.
Well, and it's just huge productivity gains,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like so like in economics, you would say we in some degree you could say we've had this like labor windfall, right? Because the agents, the AI is like doing labor that otherwise we would have had to hire people to do. And so, one person doing the job of two people now is probably real, right? But that contributes overall to growth, right? Because like that means more people can get more done more
Yeah.
quickly. And so the productivity levels just go up. I sometimes find myself like manically doing more because we can just, I have more available to me in terms of resources. And in my team, I'm watching my team members um, use it more and more. And just like the amount, now I'm getting feedback in a lot quicker pace. And so everything just moving faster, right? And like they'll send me a 20-page analysis of some data set. And I'm like, crap, I got to go through that whole thing. And he just turned it around in 24 hours, And like, so it is. I mean, the pace, it's changed the pace of business inside the firm for sure.
It's just definitely given you the opportunity to work much smarter. So
Yeah.
instead of having to get through those five or seven items before you get to that like deep think stage, you don't have to worry about that stuff as much anymore. And it's allowing our developers to focus more heavily on needle move. We call them like needle mover features, right? It allows, our marketing team and our analysts to get through some of that like more mundane stuff to focus on the things that really matter. And that's where I've seen, for me personally, that's where I've seen a huge advantage is being able to spend time going through the things that matter, more than, those handful of check the box things I need to get done every day.
Yeah, and with AI, that you're seeing the growth of data centers, and it's become a very controversial land use in America. And I know you've got fresh survey data on that public sentiment. So what's the gap between the communities fearing about a data center moving in and what your migration and economic data say actually happens to those towns, let's say in like 2, 5, or 10 years?
Sure. I can start and then I'll have Jon fill in because
Okay.
Jon sits a little closer to some areas and I sit a little closer to the migration side. So um, a couple of years ago, we started doing a lot of conversations around NIMBYism, the yes in my backyard zoning policies, et cetera. And I found it so fascinating with my background in policy. So I've kind of clutched to these ideas because I think they're so fascinating. But essentially, data centers have become the new NIMBY issues of
Yeah.
today. We moved a little bit away from can you build an ADU in my backyard? Can you rezone for duplexes to now worrying about data centers and the power of AI that sort of comes behind all of that. So I think it's really interesting. The biggest disconnect seems to be, when you look at sentiment, environmental, electricity usage, water concerns, that seems to be where your general public has a negative perception. But when you're asking questions around job growth, tax revenue benefits, it's viewed relatively positive. So there's certainly a disconnect between, or there's a missed opportunity on educating the public there. But when you look at how that ties back to where we're seeing migration trends or positive job growth, positive wage growth, I think you can look right to Loudoun County in Northern Virginia. I live in Arlington County. Loudoun's right next door. And that area has really been booming over the last handful of years, and they show steady growth. They show positive job establishments, positive wage growth, high income. I mean, Loudoun County has one of the highest median incomes across the entire country. I think 15 years ago, that really wasn't the case for Loudoun. And, anecdotally, no one is really bothered about the data centers there. But if you take a look at, very close proximity, Prince George's County in Maryland, they decided to pause a tax incentive around data centers because of the public backlash that it received. And I think those are very stark comparisons to one another when you look at them side by side and what's happening with migration. So there's certainly something there with the sentiment around it. I think it will pass the same way that we've gone a little quieter on rezoning for housing. But it's certainly fascinating right now. Jon, I don't know if you want to add something.
No, I think look, because of the organization we're in, we run a lot of survey research, right? Like we literally have a daily survey that goes across the whole nation, asking 75 to 100 questions a day. And so we were able to like gather a lot of data on the perception of data centers and across the nation, and a few things that like are I think are kind of most interesting to us is that everyone is uniquely, no one's like strongly for really in a huge way, no one's like strongly against, but when they are one way or the other, it seems to be like the positives in everyone's view is they create jobs. People are kind of aligned that job creation is a good thing for data centers, and that they create, tax revenue, right? So to Devin's point about Loudoun, those they've been able to keep their overall like property taxes lower for the individuals because the data centers pay a lot of property taxes. They get great schools out of it. The FT had an article kind of a deep dive on data centers, and they were talking about one in DeKalb, Illinois, which is like kind of right outside of St. Louis. And a meta facility that was going up there helped pay for a $33 million elementary school, right? In a kind of disenfranchised neighborhood. So like definitely, and there's been a lot of podcasts on this too about like the bad perception data centers are getting and the poor job the tech industry is doing on actually making the case for the data centers. And we definitely see that. And I think there needs to be some more education in these local communities about how they're actually a positive for the local community, how they're a positive for the tax base. They pay for parks, they pay for schools, right? They help keep your property tax burden lower in some ways. And we have, because data centers have been around for a long time, we actually have good information about the effects of data centers. Now, the one big thing that's changed is that 87% of like existing data centers or so are in urban areas, right? But 2/3 of the new planned facilities are in rural areas. And so really you're addressing a new population with these data centers that haven't had to deal with it for a while. And their concerns around water, which may be a little bit unfounded, the data centers used to use a lot of water, but now they're more closed loop systems and they don't use as much as they used to. But the electricity concerns are probably real, right? The country hasn't invested in the grid. They haven't invested in more generation, and especially in the Mid-Atlantic region, they have seen increased electricity prices that have affected people. And so that's probably a negative, and something that policy and the data center community and the utilities are going to have to deal with and understand. They're going to have to find a way to make sure it doesn't increase the rate burdens on residential electricity. And they haven't done a good effort or at really solving that, I think.
Yeah, but I think at the end of the
That's my two
day,
cents.
education is what needs to
That's key.
be, yeah, it's the
Yeah,
key. And
yeah.
it needs to be done in a way where the people who have this bad perception, or they're just reading the news, or they're going through their social media, how can you change their mind by giving them facts that they
Yeah.
could easily see, like for them to change their perception? And
Evan, what was that
unfortunately,
comment you saw something about data centers were less
Oh my
popular
gosh.
than,
What was
yeah,
it? A survey that was done by Heat Map.
yeah,
I was chuckling by it. 44% of the survey respondents had a negative reaction to the idea of data centers being built in close proximity to where they were living. And the reaction was more negative than power plants, new
wow,
gas lines, battery charging
storage.
facilities that could blow up, and the best one was nuclear reactor facilities. So there was a more negative perception of having a data center, which has, positive impact on the economy. And to Jon's point, everything I was reading up on was the impact of schools and lowering that tax burden on homeowners, et cetera, than a nuclear facility, which I think was quite it was astounding. And I think that's, where policymakers and data center investors need to really be able to cut through the noise of what you're hearing on the negative side, to put some of their facts out there about those positive offsets.
Yeah, it's really been blown out of proportion, I think is the point, right? And I, you know, I personally, yes, there's going to be bad actors. There's a place for zoning to make sure these things don't go up too close to residential neighborhoods, that the noise is isolated from the community, right? Like that's local planners doing their jobs, right? But a lot of these things can be negated, or the what is perceived as negative can be negated by just good planning. Um, and there's a lot of positives. So and we're on our side, we're helping a lot of our internal Coke organizations understand demand for these things, understand supply constraints. There's a ton of supply constraints right now in the whole
right.
industry. Labor, I think over 80% of private sector growth in 2025 was because of data centers, right? So like the whole AI sector is driving a massive economic expansion that has been good for the whole country, quite honestly. And things may have not have been as great over the past year or two were it not for this kind of new innovation and growth of the data center segment. So I think there's just a lot of positives um, going on, and we just need to make sure that the way we're trying to help at CENSAI is and Rushmore is education. What can we do with our nonprofit community and helping advocate and educate and knock on doors and do things like that try to get the right policies in place to enable that growth to continue, because there is a real risk that the politics gets in the way and this whole thing gets slowed down in a massive way, and I don't think that's the outcome the country wants.
Yeah, we definitely don't want that. So you spend your day looking at where Americans are chasing opportunity, where they're running from disaster. So has any of the data changed how you think about where you would raise your own family?
Well, just coming out of that data center conversation, I live so close to all the data centers. So I think yes and no, I guess. I feel really good and confident in our decision to settle here. So probably not, but I think it is, for me, it's more anecdotally fun to look at. I grew up in Pittsburgh, so it's fun to look at Pittsburgh as a market and see how it's really, I've watched it develop. Did my undergrad in Pittsburgh. I watched it drastically change from when I was young there. So it's fun, and there's a little bit of a sweet spot there to watch it really come into its prime. But generally, I think we're pretty settled where we are, and I use it more anecdotally for where people are moving in conversations than where I want to move next, I guess.
So we had our first two children in New York City. And we're having number three when we moved to the suburbs of Philadelphia, where I am. And the reason we did that was like, raising three kids in New York City is very tough.
Oh
Uh,
yeah.
Schools, there wasn't a lot of school choice, right? Um, and you could envision the day where they're going to be in sports, where we're all in now, sports, all the extracurriculars, everything. And like, we've been very happy where we are, which is like, suburban Philadelphia, great schools, right? I think the data centers are contributing to that. If you have great schools, property prices tend to go up, right? And tying that back to migration, I think one of the things we saw in COVID was, millennials who had been kind of slow to start forming households suddenly started forming households in a big way and moving from inner city or urban environments to suburban environments, right? And why did they do that? Because they needed schools for their kids, right? They needed safe places for their kids and they needed that convenience. And I think, honestly, and the affordability, right? So there's a lot of that where we live now that I wouldn't change at this point. Now, when I retire, would I go back to city? Yeah, maybe. I don't like maintaining a single family home. I thought I would love it, but it's
The
actually
gift
just
that
huge
keeps on
burden.
giving.
Yes. Yeah. The maintenance, it's
Yeah,
nonstop.
yeah, exactly. But yeah, no, it's been a great place to raise our kids, and yeah, I don't think I would change anything.
That's great to hear. Yeah, I just recently moved from the city and am now in Long Island, so I definitely understand making that big move. Quickly, before we say goodbye, I would love to know what's one piece of advice that you've gotten recently that's actually stuck. Devin, you can go first.
Oh my gosh. Um, you're gonna need to come back to me. I need to think
Okay,
about
all
this
right.
for a
Sorry,
second.
I know
Sorry, you put me on the
I
spot,
put you
Ryan.
on
I
the
wasn't ready
spot.
for that.
John, anything?
Um, I don't know. A piece of advice that I've got that stuck was, this could be anywhere, but it was like, it's better to tell an unkind truth than it is to tell a kind lie, right? And so, you know, facing, working with a lot of people and facing the hard facts are sometimes the best way forward than not facing the facts, I guess, in a way. So like that I think they got popped up in my Twitter feed recently, and it kind of stuck with me. I'm like, oh yeah, I believe that. No, but I think the best piece of advice was never say anything you didn't want on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. So
That's
or
very good
put
advice.
another way, don't ever have say something you wouldn't want your mother to hear. So I think I've always lived by that, and that's been probably better advice than anything I've ever received.
Yeah. I think, for me, it's not new advice, but something I try and really keep in mind is trusting your gut. I think you can second guess a lot of things in the rules that Jon and I both have. But learning or continuing to trust your gut. And when something's telling you to hold back on something or push forward, um, just like we were talking before, you got to cut through all the noise and trust and run on instinct sometimes. It's not always going to be the best decision, but I think, what you're doing and you just need to trust yourself. And that's been, I think, one of the things I try and think about the most. Because, over the last 2 years, we pushed a number of features out. We've changed our product offering, and you just have to trust that you know what you're doing there.
Yeah, that's great words to live by. I really love both of your takes there. Thank you so much for joining us. This was such a great conversation, and I really loved diving deep into your company. Where can our audience members find you, Devin?
So you guys can always find me on LinkedIn. We'll be at conferences over the next coming months, but everything around CENSAI is at senseianalytics.com.
John, where can they find you?
I'm on LinkedIn. That's probably the best way. If you want to connect with me directly on LinkedIn, it's great. I have an X problem, but I'm really not interactive on there. I just more of a browser. Yeah, so that's but yeah, LinkedIn is a great way to connect with me, and we do have this other business that provides data on Rushmore Labs. So Sensei is part of Rushmore Labs, and
Yep.
that's rushmorelabs.com where we work with a lot of other data sets that we have internally where we do some work on those. So
All right. Well, thank you so much. I wish you both all the success.
Thank you
thanks,
so
Ryan.
much,
Thanks for
Ryan.
having us.
Yeah, it's great talking.
Yeah.
All right.
All right.
Be sure to stay tuned for my recap. That was a great conversation with Devin Boesen and Jon Liggett of CENSAI. Here's what I'm walking away with. First, the data center finding. They shared survey data showing that power plants and nuclear sites are polling more favorably than data centers in communities being asked to host them. That is a remarkable gap. The industry tells a real story about real jobs, tax base, and long term economic impact. And it's losing its narrative because the education isn't happening where it needs to be. Americans are actually forming their opinions through social media instead of actually reading the data that's out there. And that's very troubling. Second, AI is making them faster, not different. They are working smarter. Work that used to take them 3 hours is now taking them 15 minutes. So, with the right workflow, AI can really give you back hours in the day. Third, the climate migration is happening within state lines, not across the country. People aren't fleeing from the Gulf Coast to the Midwest. They're moving 150 to 200 miles inland, staying close to family, jobs, and the life that they've already built. These futurists that are predicting that there's going to be this huge migration into the Midwest, the data actually tells quite a different story. And lastly, the lines that really ties this all together, the right niche data beats all the market data in the world. Whether you're an underwriting a student housing project or you're rehabbing a multifamily unit, the decision that wins is the one that makes with your data point that your competitor doesn't have. Devin and Jon didn't just meet in the dorm room, they met in a conference room mid career, putting their reputations on the line, proof that the best founder pairings are not always the storybook version. Well, that's all the time we have today. Thank you so much to Devin Boesen and Jon Liggett of CENSAI. If you joined the episode, please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. If you have any questions or if you want to reach us, you can email us at info@creunplug.com or you can reach us at our website at www.creunplug.com. See you next time, and until then, keep your conversations real and unplugged.